Yeah. Since you have a presentation,
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
I've noticed in the last few years, it's actually better to do yeah. But I know. I tried to.
Well, last time I went first, and our topics are kind of pretty different.
Yeah.
So maybe stuff like since I got here.
Right, exactly.
I mean, what is going to be okay, sure.
That they're not going to be studying.
Yep.
So I have 20 to 25 minutes?
Yes. Let's start.
And yeah, I won't take up that moment.
Okay. We have till 1 o'clock, so. Do you supervise the interns?
Me personally? No.
Okay. mention that in your introduction.
But I don't know.
I think it's like Lisa
I know one of them.
Dan Lindsay. Okay. Right.
Are you getting my messages?
Yeah, I was just writing notes.
Okay, I just wanted to make sure.
I'm gonna get it for you.
Video now because I just I was getting sound but no video.
Might have been.
You like have
So I think with like, if you want to aim for like 15 to 20 minutes, then you can have time at the end for questions. That'd be great.
How do you take questions at the end of my segment? Make sure I. Tell me what you want to do.
Adam said he would prefer if you guys hold this one and then sessions at the end. So I just have a few housekeeping issues I want to mention. Hi, my name is Sheila Sinhan and I'm the program manager at Kelly. I hope you guys have been having a great summer thus far and enjoying the steamy weather. We are almost coming to an end to our Pili Internship and Fellowship Program. I know some Pili Fellows are going on until the fall. But I just want to remind everybody to fill out the service tracking form for May and June if you haven't done so already. We have an email that was sent out to from Mike Bergman to you all with a link to it. We'll also have a service tracking form sent out for your second part of your Pili internship or fellowship, and that's something we'd love for you guys to all fill out then as well. We'll have an evaluation sent out at the end of the summer, so please take some time to provide us with your feedback. We really take that seriously and we try to improve our programs based on what you guys say there. So today we have a session today that's on fair and affordable housing initiatives, and we have two great speakers that have had a lot of experience in the housing sector. We have Adam Gross here from BPI, Business and Professional People for the Public Interest. Adam is not only a former Pili intern, he is also a Pili board member and he regularly supervises Pili interns and fellows. He joined BPI in 1995 and he was also a Pili intern there and he now directs EPI's affordable housing program, which works to create and preserve affordable housing in Chicago's metropolitan region. We also have Rich Wheelock from LAF, formerly known as the Legal Assistance Foundation. Rich, for years and decades actually, has played a unique role in shaping city policies and has been a staunch advocate for the residents of Chicago and the metropolitan area. So please join me in welcoming these two speakers here today.
Thank you. Let's see. So, thank you, Sheila. Just stand to the side here. I'm the Director of Advocacy at LAF, and for those of you who don't know, LAF provides civil legal services for low-income families in civil matters for Cook County. And we have a main office downtown. We're kind of like a general practice law firm for low-income families. And I've spent much of my professional life representing public housing families and public housing organizations, tenant organizations over those many years. And since 1994, actually, we've been working quite a bit with the Cabrini Green Local Advisory Council, which is a tenants organization for the Cabrini Green public housing development on the north side of Chicago. And we've, in fact, we have filed 2 federal lawsuits, now 3 federal lawsuits on their behalf in challenging CHA's policies and procedures regarding relocation of families, demolition of buildings. And most recently, we filed a lawsuit in this past June against CHA regarding their plans for the Cabrini Row houses, which is a low-rise 600-unit development just north of Chicago Avenue. And before I kind of get into the substance of my presentation, I'm going to just play a short NPR report that actually talks about CHA's current status of their plan for transformation and talks a little bit about the lawsuit that we filed.
In Chicago, a decade-long experiment in public housing has seen notorious high-rises come down and thousands of tenants relocated into better accommodations. Now, city leaders want to use public funds not just to build homes for the poor, but also stores where they can shop and work. NPR Cheryl Corley reports that's an idea that some tenants and their advocates are fighting, saying it will be at the expense of affordable housing.
The Chicago Housing Authority CEO, Charles Woodyard, says when he drives through thriving parts of the city, he sees
a lot of mixed income development. I see huge amounts of commercial, retail, everywhere, a lot of shopping.
And that, Woodyard says, is what he wants to build on vacant land in some of the city's poorer areas. He envisions neighborhoods bustling with a mix of poor and middle-class residents, grocery stores, and more. But one group of public housing residents say that would be fine if none of them are driven out. It's a warm, sunny day, and tenants and advocates gather outside the Cabrini Green row houses, not far from Chicago's downtown skyscrapers. The last of Cabrini's high-rises were demolished 2 years ago, and there are plenty of mixed-income developments nearby. Carol Steele has lived most of her life in Cabrini. She doesn't think much of the Housing Authority's new phase, the so-called Plan Forward.
To me, it's about a land grab.
Only about a third of the 600 row houses are rehabbed. The rest sit vacant and shuttered behind a chain-link fence. The Chicago Housing Authority, known as the CHA, had promised all public housing residents could return, but many are still living in temporary housing and want to come back to their neighborhood.
We got all the expressways right at our fingertips, you know, all the L stops right at our fingertips. And we got a multitude of stores, so, you know, this is a great opportunity for everyone. So I try to chase it out this area.
The vacant row houses sit at the heart of the dispute over Chicago's massive public housing overhaul and the mission of public housing itself. Despite the promise to residents, there are questions about the future of the home. A few years ago, the CHA announced the row houses would become a mixed income development. Now officials say there's been no final decision. CEO Woodyard agrees there is a dire need for affordable housing in Chicago, but he says the country has seen how urban neighborhoods made up solely of public housing work, and he says they just don't work.
I think the evidence shows and the research shows that that is not a model that allows families to move up and have of subsidized housing. It's not a model that's proven to be conducive to public safety and being good neighbors to the surrounding community. It is not the model that we want to pursue and plan forward.
Cabrini residents are suing the CHA in federal court. Attorney Elizabeth Rosenthal calls any plan to demolish the row houses illegal and says they all should be rehabbed so former residents can return to the racially diverse neighborhood.
CHA failing to do that violates the Fair Housing Act, perpetuates segregation, and discriminates against low-income and African-American families.
Chicago's years-long public housing experiment has been closely watched by agencies throughout the country and by researcher Susan Popkin with the Urban Institute. She and her team kept in touch with several CHA families who were relocated when their buildings were torn down.
And they're living in better housing, in safer neighborhoods. They feel better. For the most part, they feel less scared, they feel less anxious. That's the success. That's why it's basically a housing intervention.
But some goals went unmet. The CHA says it aims to transform lives, but many of the 38,000 families using vouchers to rent in the private market often ended up in other racially segregated and poor neighborhoods. And children in CHA families didn't see much improvement in their lives. Those are problems the CHA says its new plan forward could change. It calls for the agency to acquire and rehab apartments and homes in different communities, to offer more social services to adults and children, and to use some CHA land for something other than housing to help provide jobs and other opportunities. Cheryl Corley, NPR News, Chicago.
So the fate of the Cabrini row houses provides an interesting focal point on the whole debate of what is the future for public housing, both here in Chicago and nationally. Kind of put it in a broader context citywide. CHA in 2000 had promised to build or rehab 25,000 units of public housing. At that point in time, the housing stock was actually 40,000 units. But because much of the stock was in very poor repair, beyond repair, CHA got permission from HUD to do massive demolition, to demolish the high rises, bring the housing stock from 40,000 down to 25,000. But in exchange, CHA promised to either build brand new or fully rehab 25,000 units. And so part of the original plan was, unlike the rest of the Cabrini, the Cabrini row houses are low rises, two-story buildings. And so CHA had originally planned to rehab those 600 units. The idea being they're not high rises, it's much more controllable space. Plus the row houses are in what's referred to as an opportunity area. It's an area of racial diversity, of economic diversity, an area close to jobs, schools, medical care, lakefront, Gold Coast. I mean, there's obviously, we're talking at, Chicago and Orleans, or Chicago and Hudson. So then CHA last year made a decision that it was not going to rehab the row houses. Instead, the decision was we're going to convert the row houses from 100% public housing into their traditional mixed income housing. And what CHA has been doing is, where the high rises stood, convert the property into housing that's 30%, approximately 30% or a third public housing, A third, what's referred to as affordable housing, which kind of targets working poor, and a third, or up to 50% of market rate housing, either in the form of for sale housing and rental housing. But in the situation of the row houses, that presented the issue of, well, if you convert these 600 units into a mixed income community as defined by COJ, you're going to, by definition, lose 2/3 of the units from that site. And it begs the question, where, since you're going to have to build those 25,000 units, where else are you going to build them? And to date, CHA has been making up that difference in areas of you know, on the west side of Chicago, where it's very segregated, very low-income areas of town. Obviously, not areas that provide the same opportunity that the public housing families now enjoy in living in the row houses, living in north side of Chicago. So the challenge is what to do, to challenge this plan. And actually, Cabrini row houses are kind of in a similar situation to another public housing development, Lathrop Homes on the north side, where the same debate is ongoing. Lathrop Homes are low-rise, mid-rise buildings located in a diverse community. CHA wants to convert that area into its traditional mixed-income model, whereas the residents, the public housing residents and housing advocates say, no, let's convert this site into an affordable housing community. There's plenty of market rate housing already in this area. We don't need to divert precious public resources to turn part of this site into market rate housing. So this is a tool that you're probably very familiar with, the Fair Housing Act. And, our thought was that, hey, by turning this area from a 100% public housing site into a mixed income community, you're losing 2/3 of the units. The premise is that these units are going to be rebuilt in segregated areas of town, that in effect you're perpetuating segregation. And the Fair Housing Act makes it unlawful to refuse otherwise to make unavailable a dwelling to any person because of race, color, etc. Now, you may have in school, in your classes, studied Arlington Heights, that had found that this section of the Fair Housing Act supports a discriminatory effects cause of action, which means that you don't have to show that in this situation the housing authority is intentionally trying to discriminate against African Americans, but that the impact of their non-discriminatory actions on their face is having a discriminatory effect on the families. So it's interesting that earlier this year, March 18th, well, let me back up a little. Every circuit has a different effects test in determining, how one is to articulate a discriminatory effects test or satisfy. And what HUD did was it issued a rule in March saying this is the discriminatory effects test that we will be using when we're entertaining or reviewing administrative complaints that are being filed with HUD. And the hope is that although this test isn't binding on the different district courts and federal courts of appeal, the hope is that it will provide a model that the whole country could follow. Now, the discriminatory effects test that HUD outlines in its rule is not much different than what really the Arlington Heights case sets forth. First, the plaintiff must prove that the challenge practice caused, or particularly will cause, a discriminatory effect. Second, well, then the burden, once you show that there's a discriminatory effect that's going to occur, then the burden shifts to the defendant to show that the challenge practice or action is necessary to achieve a non-discriminatory interest of the defendant. Now, in the case of, talking about Cabrini row houses, we plead this discriminatory effect. Families are going to be resegregated, perpetuating segregation. CHA will come back and say, hey, we're trying to create a mixed income community. And in order to, we're trying to better the lives of public housing families. Public housing families will fare better if they live in a mixed income community as we define it, meaning with mixed with market rate housing and other affordable housing. And so that justifies us, knocking out 2/3 of the units at the Cabrini row houses. So if the defendant or CHA in this case can satisfy that part, their burden, then it switches back to the plaintiffs to say, hey, there's another way of achieving your goal here. And here, it would be incumbent upon the plaintiffs in the case that we brought, the Cabrini LLC, to show that, hey, you can, by maintaining the Cabrini row houses as 100% public housing in this community, the families will fare just as well compared to demolishing most of these units and turning it into a income community. This slide pretty much just restates what I just said. That we can still. So the question is, how can you keep the Cabrini row houses 100% public housing and still achieve the larger social goals of a mixed income community that CHA is trying to achieve? And this is the things that have actually changed since the days when the Cabrini row houses were originally erected. Our argument is that under the new policies that CHA has in place for traditional public housing, that in effect you still can create a mixed income community, but within the spectrum of eligibility allowed for public housing. So what do I mean by that? So for example, for a family of four, under current public housing law, can earn up to $59,000 a year and still be a public housing family. So obviously that encompasses the working poor, and frankly, some of your friends and family that may fall into this category or would technically qualify for public housing. CHA now has a work requirement for all new admissions. So anyone who becomes a public housing family under CHA must be working, must be employed. Obviously, that means they're bringing in income and the other indicia of stability and all the other social benefits that come along with it. CHA also has a rule that 50% of all the new admissions must make more than $22,000 for a family of four. So that means CHA is authorized to skip, once they admit a very low-income family, working family, they can skip over other very low-income families until they find a family on the wait list that makes at least $22,000 a year for a family of four. And of course, CHA now has not only a work requirement in order to be admitted, but also has a work requirement in order to stay. Families can be evicted if they are no longer employed, if they don't otherwise qualify for an exception, for example, if you're disabled or our elders. So the net result of these policies is, our argument, and the residents argue, is that a newly rehabbed Cabrini row houses would in fact be a mixed income community and would no longer reflect the deep poverty of past public housing developments and all the ills and problems that came with concentrating extreme poverty in one location. So as you know, alluded to, you know, in the audio piece I ran, you know, that was covering actually the press conference in May. We filed a lawsuit in federal court challenging CHA's plan to not rehab the row houses as 100% public housing, challenging that as a violation of the Fair Housing Act because it would effectively perpetuate segregation, because to make up for those lost units, most of those units will be relocated to very poor segregated areas of town. So it's an interesting debate. We're in the midst of that litigation, and that the same debate also frames what's going on at Lathrop Homes, and also there's another public housing development on the west side of Chicago where that same debate is going on. So my understanding is we're going to take questions at the end of this session. I hope you do have, because this raises a lot of interesting questions and concerns about, you know, what kind of public housing community should we have? And what's the best model? And whether we're doing the right thing for families that we all agree, as a society, we have an obligation to provide, you know, good, affordable housing options. Okay, thank you. Can we turn this? You can turn this on.
Hi, I'm Adam Gross from BPI Business and Professional People for the Public Interest. The worst named organization anywhere. So I should just say at the outset, like, withhold judgment. We do the opposite of what it sounds like from the name. So the title of this session is something about fair housing and affordable housing. And I'm going to talk mostly about foreclosure, which is related to both of those things. And I'm not going to talk too directly about issues of race once I start talking about foreclosure, but this is like the whole frame for the crisis. So let's say a little bit about that at the beginning. If you look back over the last 10 years especially, 10 or 15 years, and look at times when really horrible mortgages were being written, mortgages that it was pretty clear on the face of them people wouldn't be able to afford. African American borrowers were much more likely than white borrowers to get really expensive, high-risk loans. Hispanic borrowers were much more likely than non-Hispanic white borrowers to get these kinds of loans, and then have defaulted on those loans at much higher rates. So we see that foreclosure rates are dramatically higher in predominantly African American neighborhoods and in predominantly Latino neighborhoods. And there's also a lot of evidence that says once properties are foreclosed, once a bank has taken ownership of a property, they do a much better job of maintaining those properties, helping to ensure some degree of stability in the neighborhood, in white neighborhoods than in predominantly African American or Hispanic neighborhoods. And there's another thing that's it's not directly related to what I'm talking about, but it's another thing that sort of makes my head explode, and it's relevant, especially in this context, which has to do with housing as a way to decrease inequality, and housing as a way to build wealth. So if you look historically in the United States, African American families and Latino families have held much more of their wealth, the really valuable stuff that they have, in housing than in investments, than in 401ks or stocks or bonds, any of those sorts of things. So when the value of housing declines, as it did really precipitously over the last bunch of years, African American families and Latino families are much harder hit by that. And if you look at these patterns, and what's happening now is prices of housing have gone way, way down. So this is an opportunity for people to buy stuff and build a lot of wealth as housing starts to appreciate again. But we're now denying credit to African American and Latino families especially. So we had this period of time when we made it incredibly easy at the height of the market, right, when housing was most expensive, made it really easy for people to buy housing even when they probably shouldn't have, even though that was really high-risk behavior on the part of the lender and the borrower. And then lots of that wealth was destroyed when the housing market collapsed, and that had a disparate impact on African American families and Latino families. And now that there's a time to build wealth again because prices have gone down, we have policies that are effectively keeping potential African American homebuyers and Hispanic homebuyers out of the market. If you look like after World War II, when we made it a big national policy to encourage home building, that was a way to really decrease inequality. After me. Home buying was a way to decrease inequality. Now, over the last 10 years, we've seen a huge increase in inequality. Housing policy can be used as a tool to decrease inequality, but it is likely only to expand inequality as we leave people out of the housing market today. So that's all by way of background for the foreclosure stuff. So we're working on foreclosure in a variety of ways. So one critical, and I'll talk about three of them. First thing is trying to keep people in their homes, trying to avoid foreclosure in the first place. Second thing is saying, if you wind up having to foreclose on a property, if there's no good alternative to foreclosure, we want to minimize the effects of foreclosure on neighborhoods. So if you have neighborhoods where there are lots and lots of foreclosed buildings, in some places 4, 6, 8, 10, 12 on a single block, that's devastating for the community. You know, it's devastating for the kids who have to walk every day past those empty buildings on their way to school. It's devastating for the schools that are losing students, but still have to pay to heat the building and to pay the teachers. It's devastating for religious institutions that are, the backbone of so many neighborhoods because they're losing members. It's devastating for businesses in the neighborhood because they're losing the financial base. So it's really essential that buildings stay maintained. That's the second thing. What do we do to keep buildings maintained? And then the third thing is, what do we do to get vacant properties back into productive use? Not just to make certain that they don't totally collapse while they're empty, but that we get people back into them and part of stable, growing communities. So with regard to keeping people in their homes, I'm going to talk very quickly about two things that we've done. One is there's a lot of evidence that says that that financial institutions were foreclosing frequently in situations where foreclosure didn't make sense for anybody. Right? Somebody's going to lose their home. Property's going to wind up vacant. It's going to be very difficult for the entity that's taken ownership of that property to sell at any time. The person who was in the home might not have been able to pay all that they owed, but they could pay something, and that deal would be better for the financial institution than having that property vacant for a long time. Even though it made sense for everybody, there were many situations where financial institutions and homeowners weren't finding some common ground where we'd say, oh, this is a better alternative for both of us. So we, in collaboration with a lot of community organizations, stole an idea from a number of other jurisdictions around the country that make it possible for during the foreclosure process for homeowners to meet directly with some representative of the lending institution, the foreclosing entity, just to sit down and say, can we find some alternative to foreclosure that's going to be better for both of us? Not going to require any different outcome, but just to say, you know, let's look case by case at this very specific case and see if we can find an alternative. And what we saw in lots of other jurisdictions was if you just created the space to do that, sometimes you have to put a little bit of pressure on the financial institutions to sort of do it fairly, like really to give people a fair shake. But you found that the number of foreclosures decreased pretty dramatically. Lots and lots of cases where you were able to find alternatives to foreclosure. So a few years ago, Cook County adopted a program like this. There are thousands of families that have participated. I'm very unhappy to say that the program has worked nowhere near as well as it should, in part because I think it's become increasingly clear that where the programs have succeeded best, there's been some pressure, sometimes it's subtle pressure, not great pressure, put on the foreclosing entities to really engage in fair play in the process. And the court system here has been very reluctant to do that. So the mediation program has not produced the same kind of results that it has elsewhere. I still think it's a promising model, and there's more that we can do to improve it. It's a tragedy that we're this far into the process, and as many people have lost their homes as have lost their homes when that could have been avoided. But there's still work underway to strengthen the mediation program. Second thing about keeping people in their homes. Huge numbers of people, there are actually more renters who lose their home because of foreclosure than homeowners who lose their home because of foreclosure. We typically think of foreclosure as being about people who own their homes losing their homes. Well, people who own rental properties also lose their properties, and the folks who live in those rental buildings are sometimes the unwitting victims. So you have folks who are paying their rent, abiding by their leases. Financial institution forecloses, takes over the property because we're not in the business of managing properties. We don't want to do it. So as soon as we're able to, we're going to kick people out of their homes. Which again, devastating for the people who live in their homes, and devastating for the neighborhood when those properties become vacant, and in many cases stay vacant. So again, we work with a large coalition of community organizations, and the Chicago City Council passed an ordinance relatively recently that gives new protections to renters. It basically says if you're a financial institution and you foreclose on a rental property, you can still evict people if you want to evict them, but you're going to have to pay a very significant relocation fee, more than $10,000 to each household when you move them. Or you can keep people in their units and sell the property to someone who's going to want to maintain it as rental housing. And this ordinance hasn't yet gone into effect. So I can't say anything about how it's going to work. There are very similar programs, in fact, some much stronger programs, other places in the country that have had exactly the impact that you would anticipate. They've just kept buildings occupied, and have sometimes accelerated the pace at which the foreclosing entities will sell the properties to somebody else, but they get sold and then they're maintained as rental housing, and that's better for the folks who live there and better for the neighborhoods. So the second thing I'm going to mention is maintaining vacant properties for that period of time, maintaining vacant properties before they're reoccupied. Huge problem in Chicago and in many other places is that the foreclosure process can last a really long time. It averages about 2 years in the city of Chicago. Oftentimes, properties become vacant long before the foreclosure process is complete. So somebody lives there, they say, I know I've got no way to save the home, and they leave. Property sits vacant, and until relatively recently, there was no one effectively who was responsible for maintaining that property. Under Chicago law, it was the owner's responsibility to maintain it, but the owner's taken off and isn't coming back. So what happens then? So Chicago City Council passed an ordinance almost 2 years ago, more than 2 years ago now, which says if you are a lender, you have a mortgage interest in a property, and the property becomes vacant, you can be held to essentially the same standards of maintaining and securing a property as the owner would be held to. Now, if you're not interested in the property, you can walk away. There's a legal process you can go through to release the lien, and it's all public, and we know you're leaving, and it's not yours, and then you're not responsible for it. But as long as you're going to maintain some interest in the property, even if you haven't taken ownership of it yet, you've got to maintain that property. And the hope there is that if, particularly in blocks where you have many, many vacant properties, and where some people are investing in the vacant properties to ensure that they stay relatively well maintained, if everybody can be held to some minimum standard of maintenance, everybody's going to be better off, right? Because the alternative is you might have 4 entities that are doing something to maintain properties and 2 that aren't, and the bad stuff that the 2 that aren't are doing will overwhelm all the good stuff that the other entities are doing, as well as all the homeowners and renters in the neighborhood who are doing their best to keep their properties up. So it's trying to hold everybody to some basic standard that will benefit everybody, including those lending institutions. And we'll see how effectively that works. We've seen some positive impact. More work needs to be done to make certain it's working in all the right places and in all the right ways. And finally, I'm going to talk about one pretty new initiative about getting properties back into productive use. So within the city of Chicago, there are, no one knows for sure, probably 35,000 vacant properties, maybe more. Countywide, the number may be more like 60,000. Statewide, it's over 100,000. So these are massive numbers. And there have been very few successful efforts to do anything with those vacant properties. We've really left it to the market to do this work, and this is one area in which the market has totally failed, and neighborhoods are suffering tremendously. So Cook County recently established something called a land bank. It's a slightly misleading term because sort of think of a bank as something that's holding land, and really the goal of the land bank is to hold stuff as briefly as possible and to get it into the hands of somebody who's going to do something with it as soon as possible. But the notion is you don't have any entity in the city or the county whose job is to deal thoughtfully with vacant property. And the experience with land banks, the places around the country that have them, is if you have an entity whose sole purpose every day is to take vacant properties and get them back into productive use, you can do a dramatically better job of taking these things which have become a detriment in communities and turn them into community assets. And that can mean lots of things. Unfortunately, in some communities, it's going to mean demolishing some buildings, because it's going to be better to have in a community where there's little or no housing market, where people aren't looking to buy or invest, at least right now. It may be better to tear a building down than to have a building that can be broken into and illegally occupied and put to bad use. And so you take that property and you can use it as a community garden, or you can give it for free to the next door neighbor who will now have and maintain a nice yard. That's not an ideal situation, but it's better than the current situation in a lot of places. The best case, land banks are doing things like transferring properties to nonprofit entities that are rehabbing them and using them for long-term affordable housing, creating cultural institutions, creating park space and things like that. And so the notion is that these things are happening privately now in very small numbers. If the Cook County Land Bank is as effective as similar land banks around the country, it will be taking thousands of properties in a small amount of time and finding new and better uses for them. I'm going to stop there so that we have time to ask Rachel a lot of questions. Thank you.
Do we have any questions or comments?